when I was like 12, in the mail, you get like life insurance. Oh, you can get cheap life insurance, blah, blah, for your kids. My parents actually took a life insurance policy out on me when I was like 12 till I was 18. It was like a 10-year policy or something like that. Just because
Costs like $1 a month, like
yeah,
so.
something super cheap. But they were like, this will just cover, because they're like, we don't know if he's going to make it like in his life. He may die, and it would be nice to have something that can cover his funeral. So, yeah, they took this really cheap insurance policy only on me, nobody else, just because I was
They told you
always
it was just to be the funeral, but they had like a $2 million life insurance
right.
package on you. Like, we're going to be set for life if he doesn't make
They're
it.
like, we love our son, but this is kind of a good opportunity. So,
We were going to be sad, but we might as well be sad and rich at the same time.
welcome to the Sellouts. I am James Schramm Financial Group, financial advisor and certified exit planning advisor. Here we talk about the good, the bad, the ugly of selling your business and what that process is like. Today we have a great guest, Ryan Condie. He's an M&A advisor, as well as he runs his own podcast called Let's Sell Your Business. And here we're going to talk a little bit about kind of meshing the perspectives of buyers and sellers and making sure that they're on good terms and we get the best valuations, and kind of the tips and tricks of trying to raise your valuation as you're trying to sell. So Ryan, why don't you give us a little bit of your background and your history so the listeners can learn a little bit more about you?
James, thanks for having me on the show. Love the show, what you're doing, and excited to be on here. So yeah, my background is I spent years in tech, and then I started going down this path of buying businesses and went the entrepreneurial route. And I always wanted to be my own boss, and I got caught up in tech for a little bit and the shiny objects there, and then realized I didn't like the lifestyle as much. I bought my first online business in 2012, and then realized I had probably started 8 or 9 businesses previously to that were very mediocre, and realized I bought my first business and I had a customer the very first day, right? And so I went down this path of buying 8 businesses over about an 8-year span, mostly online. I do have a background in Main Street businesses. I had a candy factory. We started from scratch, got to 80 employees, and realized very quickly I hated having metal detectors to like push your product through to make sure nobody was eating a broken screw. And having 80 employees, 10% of them aren't going to show up every day when you get into manufacturing.
Yeah.
I realized very quickly this was not the lifestyle I was thrilled about. So we got distribution into Sam's Club and Walgreens and thousands of other stores, and was able to sell my equity stake in that and go deeper into the online side of things. Sold all my e-commerce businesses in 2019 and then early 2020, and realized I really liked the deal side. I'd been a buyer, I'd been a seller. I love the deal side of things. And so I turned the tables of joined the M&A advisory world, the brokerage world. And I always made fun of brokers my whole career. And then all of a sudden you become one, And so I've been brokering for 4.5, 5 years now, and mainly do online businesses, but just haven't been in the space for a long time. I see a lot of Main Street businesses and lots of unique structures and all that fun things. So talk about the entrepreneurship journey, or just what, anything about the M&A process that we're seeing now in 2025 or across the years.
Yeah, so you come from an interesting perspective. Most people I come from are people that have sold their businesses and that I've talked to, but I like that you're on the buyer side for the most part, right? So you've gone through that, you've acquired a lot of businesses, and you work on that side, on the M&A side. So what are some of the key kind of conflicts that you see between buyers and sellers when they're at the table trying to negotiate or trying to make a deal done?
Yeah, and one clarification, I do work mainly with sellers as a broker and a
Oh, okay.
brokerage. At the same time, having spent a lot of time as a buyer, I do work with a lot of buyers just across a lot of different industries. So selling, right?
Yeah.
So it's a great question. There's a bunch of reasons why sellers or entrepreneurs, in a sense, are actually thinking their business is maybe worth more to a buyer. And sometimes there's that disconnect there, because sometimes if you ask someone who's not ready to sell their business, they say, what do you want for your business, or what do you think your business is worth? And they shout out some number because it sounds really fun that they can tell their golf buddies, or it's like, well, this is actually what I need to retire at the age of 50. You might live for another 30, 40 years, and it doesn't have anything to do with the valuation of the business, right? So a couple of things in talking to hundreds and hundreds of sellers over the years and hundreds of buyers, and having been on both sides of the table myself, and when I went to go sell my businesses, I realized very quickly the risks the risks that I thought were risky within the business were not risks to the buyer, but the buyer actually had different risks that I didn't even think as risks. And what I mean by that is, as an entrepreneur, you've been running your business for 5, 10, 25 years. You've gotten really good sleeping well at night with a bunch of risks that you don't even think they're risks anymore. Whereas a buyer coming to the table, they don't have that same assurity of been able to sleep well at night for the last 20 years, knowing that, like, well, this is just going to be fine, or this customer is just going to renew over and over again because that's what they've done for the last
Yeah.
10
So
years. So
what are the main risks that you see in that type of situation? What's common?
yeah. So I was just going to dive into that. So one thing would be customer concentration, right? And that is, it's not just customer concentration. It could be any sort of concentration, supplier concentration. I've even seen it, if someone is using PayPal as their main credit card processor, PayPal is a nightmare to work with if you're on the wrong side of PayPal and you're not friends with them anymore. They'll hold your money for a year, 6 months, right? So that any sort of concentration you have in your business, let's just take an example of customer concentration. I saw a business a couple of years ago, and it really stood out to me because one of the biggest customers of this business was a sister-in-law of the owner, right?
Mm,
Well, obviously that's, one, a family risk, but
yeah.
it's also, 40% of your revenue is coming from a family member. That's obviously going to be a huge risk to a buyer, whereas the seller is like, well, no, they just keep buying from me. Well, that relationship probably isn't going to transfer. The other thing I think is common too with a customer risk is you might say, well, this customer has been with me for 15 years, but you don't think about that you go play golf with them every Friday morning, right?
Hmm.
Or you and your families go on a cruise every year. That's a very different type of customer relationship than a new buyer coming in who isn't going to go play golf with them on a Friday, right? All of a sudden, you sell the business and that new owner comes in and thinks they've got that customer locked in, and the customer is like, well, I've been kind of overpaying a little bit. Now I need to go actually run a true process and see how I can get my vendors down a little bit. The other piece that I think is not talked about enough is actually vendor or supplier concentration. That would be if people sometimes will be proud of, I found the one manufacturer in the world that makes my widget, right? That's actually quite risky because I've seen it before where factories burn up in China or something like that. Oh, they have rolling blackouts, or something pops up, or that transition from one generation to the next generation for that supplier is fumbled, and all of a sudden you don't have a new way to secure that product, or that supplier is gone, right? And so customer relationship, any type of those concentrations, you'll need backups there.
So, for example, that one supplier issue, how do you suggest that a business kind of figure that out if there's only one person that kind of does their business, or you just have to be okay with having a lower valuation?
Yeah, part of it, you could be okay with a lower valuation. And many times there isn't just one person in the world or one factory in the world that can make that product. It's about having a backup and then actually supplying a few orders to that backup throughout the year so that you could truly test the quality and make sure that it's in line. And having redundancy in that supplier relationship is really critical. And that's something that, as you take that risk off for a buyer, they're going to feel more confident. They're going to pay you more for their business because there's a lot less risk. So anytime there's less risk, there's more confidence going into the deal. And obviously your terms and your price are going to get better as you exit. And you might think, well, this is twice as much work to go find a supplier that's the backup. And yeah, it is, absolutely. But if you're
It,
able to take that risk off a buyer, they're going to feel much more confident going through with it.
Yeah, and it's going to cost some money, and that's okay, right? Like, especially when you're looking at selling, like it's going to pay off in the end to take these risks off the table. That's the first thing that we talk to when we have business owners, clients of ours that are looking to sell. Is like, what kind of risks can we get off of the table? But you brought up an interesting point of like a client or a supplier, or somebody that's buying from them is a family member or a close relationship. Do you know of a way to try to vet that type of thing out? I mean, it's easy to see if most of their business is coming from one client, right? But kind of
Mhm.
those relational type issues, do you know of a way to vet that out?
I don't. That's a good question. From vetting it out, other than that, is one of the first questions I ask: is there any family members that work in your business? Are there any family members that you do business with? And that should be one of your first things that you establish. And obviously, they could keep lying to you throughout the process, and that goes back to like having honest,
Yeah.
trust and all those pieces built up. But establishing, like, you want to find that out on day one rather than in the 11th hour, you're at the altar and you're like, whoa, I didn't know that, like, your brother does customer support. It may not be a huge role, but it's important to know that he may not be around, right? Moving forward. So I think it's a lot of getting very clear. And sure, if it's like different last names and you don't know, you could obviously push back on that a little bit. But I think if you've got a huge customer concentration at a certain point within the due diligence process, they're going to want to talk to your top customer, or they're going to want to talk to your top supplier. And there are ways to do that in a safe manner without saying I'm selling the business. It could be I'm bringing on a partner, I'm bringing on this new role, that type of thing. So you're not scaring people out, or putting it out there before the deal is done that you're selling the business.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. That makes sense. So, what other type of risks do you generally see?
So a lot of times you have entrepreneurs who've started the business many years ago, right? And I'm gonna imagine a lot of your sellers and just your listeners, they're 10, 20, 30 years into their business, right? They probably started the business out of the back of a car and $2,000 or $500, and they've rolled it and snowballed it, right?
Yeah.
There's a couple of things that start to happen when you think about selling that business, and where the valuation can get a little weird in the seller's eyes versus the buyer's eyes. And first off is you rarely have any debt when you're doing that, right? A buyer might be coming to the table with millions and millions of dollars of debt. That's a much different structure within the business. So if you have no debt and you're doing 2-3 million in EBITDA, that is a beautiful business. And then I come in, I buy your business with some investors, a bank loan, maybe a loan on top of that to kind of bridge some of the gap. There's a seller note involved. All of a sudden, I've completely changed the entire infrastructure of this business, and it's a wildly different business now that I've got debt on it. And it's much riskier when you have 70, 80% debt versus before you had no debt. When you have no debt, you've got a lot of money in the coffers. Times could go bad. They could do construction right in front of your business, and you're like, it's okay. I've got enough cash for 2 years. It's not a big deal.
Yeah.
Whereas that alone, just allocating a lot of debt payments, it doesn't allow you to move a lot. And in the short term, you're dramatically increasing the risk of that business going out of business. And that's actually something sellers don't fully understand. And I don't think buyers fully understand too, that if you take a perfectly good business and then layer up a bunch of debt, your ROI can be wildly high. At the same time, you're actually fundamentally changing that business in a different structure that you're not necessarily aware of. Another common thing that I see is like just the overall cost basis. So if you're starting this business on, 20, 30 years ago, you started it with $2,000, your cost basis was essentially just your time. It was a few $1,000 and you built this. And I'm not trying to take away from the hard work and the luck and, the missed vacations and the sleep that you put into it.
Yeah, the sweat
But if
equity.
you're selling that, yeah, your sweat equity. But if you're turning around and selling this business for 15 million, your cost basis is wildly different just from sweat equity perspective to someone coming in, buying a 5, 10, 15, $20 million business that then they've got to layer up a bunch of debt, or they've got to put their house on the market, or not on the market, but like a personal guarantee on their house. So that is one of the biggest disconnects I see is the cost basis. And it's hard to establish what that cost basis is, because what is your time worth over a decade or two of building this business versus someone coming in and trying to take it from, 15 million in revenue to 30 million in revenue? They're trying to skip those 20 years, but their cost basis is significantly higher. And as I flip it on its head, as a buyer, when you're coming in and trying to value the business, obviously the seller in the seller's eyes, they're not seeing this difference of the cost basis that they have. And so it's, if you're making adjustments to the offer and the price, you've got to tiptoe around that very carefully.
So how do you see having that kind of that marriage in those views, right? Like trying to get both sides to see the other side's, perspective, to make sure that everybody can kind of get the value or see the value. Because that's one thing. For example, I bought my father out of his side of the business, and he'll even say, and I don't know if he'll listen to this, but I know he said it, like, I gave him a deal, but I'm looking at it from my perspective. I'm like, for as easy as the transition was and all the different things that I had done to line up the business the way it is, I feel like he's actually getting a pretty good deal. So how do you kind of help that marriage or that perspective come together and be aligned?
Yeah, I love that example too, because a lot of times there's extra trust built up. It sounds like you've been working in the business previously, so you're reducing a lot of the transition risk, which isn't necessarily always there between two people who don't have that history and hasn't been working. It's almost like you're selling your business to your GM. Well, the GM's been running the business for 10 years.
Yeah.
They know how to handle that really easily, right? So that is a great question. And part of it is, you need to have realistic expectations from a selling perspective, and then realistic expectations on the buyer, right? At the end of the day, a business is worth what the market is willing to pay. So there are times where you might think, as a buyer or a seller coming into a transaction, you're like, they are way overpaying for this business. But you don't know on the back end that they've got this huge Rolodex and all this opportunity, and they've solved all these issues on scale before. And so they're coming to the business thinking, this is actually really inexpensive because I know how to fix the problems that they have. So part of it is having an open dialogue, and sellers need to be aware that their business isn't worth what they need for retirement. Their business is going to have a valuation, and it's going to be tied to what the market is going to tell them. Now, we can generally get into, multiples. It's, say it's anywhere from, say, a 3 to 5x. If it's larger, it might be a 4 to 6x on just your overall multiples on your profit. But those things can move wildly based on what you've done within the business, the growth opportunities that you have. Maybe you have backup suppliers, just like we were saying, or you don't have any customer concentration. And then ultimately, if the buyer and the seller don't come to the table with around the same agreement of what the risks that they're sharing, then they won't do a deal, right? And that's when you see deals fall apart, is when that risk profile is heavily in one direction versus the other. And it's a little bit tricky because you and your father doing a deal, there's a lot of trust built up. You could probably get a little bit creative. You could probably do a larger seller note, those types of things, where if that trust wasn't built up, someone random off the street that has an MBA or something, you might not just be like, here, I'm going to hand you my business and take 80% seller financing. And hopefully I get paid out over the next 5 years.
For sure. For sure. So as you see this, so one thing we talk to our clients about is we talk about what's called the wealth gap. So you'd kind of make reference of, hey, if somebody wants to sell their business for XYZ number because that's what they need to retire. And so we talk to our clients about that of, hey, this is your goal number of what you need with the assets that you have now, plus selling your business. What's your headline number that you need to sell this business for, to retire the way you want to? And then we do some very rough valuations of the business and say, okay, like you said, it's between 3 to 5 x of EBITDA, something like that. And then we'll say, all right, these are the things. You still have a $2 million gap where your assets plus this business, you're $2 million off of where you want to end up asset-wise for retirement. What can we do to improve the business? Maybe it's improving margins. Maybe it's improving just overall revenue or supply chain, or taking risks off the table, like you mentioned. So what are things that you've seen to kind of help bridge that wealth gap, or close that gap, or raise the value of the business to where a business owner gets ultimately what he wants out of it?
There's a couple of things that you said that I absolutely love. One, they're talking to somebody like you before they want to sell, right? Ideally a year or 2, 3 years out. Because if someone's like, I need to sell this business right now, it is what it is. You can't make any changes to it. There's no tax planning. If you needed 5 million, but you got 3 million, there's not a lot you can do about it, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that's a critical piece to understand. A couple of things that I've seen, even just recently, I just got off the phone a couple hours ago with someone who's got this great e-commerce business doing about $600,000 a year, and it's been on autopilot for years, right? So he's got 500,000 plus that he's paying himself in dividends, doing really well, but he's a little bit bored. And we went through some scenarios, and there were some growth opportunities that seemed pretty low hanging fruit for someone who was involved in the business. And I just said, like, look, these are the numbers. You go from 500,000 that you're paying yourself. If you can get this to 1 million, then all of a sudden it's not just the number, the multiplier that you're multiplying your business on. It's just a much bigger number, and you're not going to just double your exit. You'll do better than that, right? And then we went through some scenarios of how to attack that problem and that market. And then he had this renewed energy, and he's like, yeah, I'm going to go out and do this. And my role is to touch base with him in a month to make sure he didn't go back to his old ways. Because sometimes you get this renewed energy for a very short amount of time, and then you go back to your old ways. And so if you truly aren't burned out yet, there's a lot of things you can do. And some of it might just be growing the business and finding a new avenue channel that he hadn't gone down yet. I think it's important what you're saying is that, what is that number you need to retire on or be comfortable with? And if you're not retirement age or not wanting to retire, what does that give you enough wiggle room to go off and do the next thing? And then working yourself backwards, which allows you to then craft that business now versus I come up to 3 years from now, I just want to sell the business, and it is what it is.
Yeah. No, I like that. I like that. I think the planning is the most important. We try to get in front of clients 3 to 5 years ahead of time. And obviously everybody's different. And sometimes people don't think they want to sell until something happens politically or economically. And they're like, I'm done. I'm done with this industry. I'm done. This business has been good, but I just want to sell it. And so, like you said, to some point, it's too late to make any major changes. But are there any kind of last minute changes or little things that businesses can do to get a better valuation?
Yeah, good question. And just to piggyback on your other comment, I love it when people have a renewed energy or they want to go back in to their business and they're 2 or 3 years out from selling. Because what it's also doing is showing that they value the business more than the market would right now.
Hmm.
And that's a wonderful position to be in because it just goes to show there's a lot of belief left in that business or industry or whatever that even if they were to sell, a new owner would then be able to come and experience some of that growth. Okay, so your question around like what are some things in the short term? Obviously, the main one, you've probably hit on this with your clients a million times. You've got to have clean financials. That is going to be one of the things that I see the most is not having clean financials. And part of that is you can't really do it last minute. Obviously, you can go back in, you can fix some bookkeeping stuff. But if you took, your trips to Maui and had all your expenses, anything you could think of running through your business, you just have this mix of personal and business. It's really hard to separate those. And it's also hard for a bank, if someone is trying to get some financing, to separate those. And that is going to be the biggest thing that you see. You might have multiple businesses under the same tax entity. You might have, all of your personal expenses. And I've seen it where people have paid, their mom and their grandma and everything through their business. And they've got their Porsche through their business and their trips to Maui. And all of a sudden, that business that looks like it's doing a few million a year in profit looks like it's doing $1 million. You just can't finance those businesses. And a seller might say, well, isn't that the buyer's problem? It's your problem too,
Yeah.
right? If there's no financing for a buyer to come to the table, then there's no way for them to improve their ROI, or you're asking for someone to come out of pocket for millions and millions of dollars versus a lot less and then use some bank financing there too. So generally, the more financing options you have, the more buyers you're going to have, which then increase the price and increase your terms that you can actually work with. So doing the things earlier on, and you might see this too a lot, James, is like you've got someone who's trying to maximize their exit versus maximizing their tax savings. And
Yeah.
those are wildly two different camps. And so as they start talking to you, you can maximize your tax savings, but it might actually hurt someone's ability to finance the business, and it's going to hurt your ability to exit. So I would say having clean and buttoned up financials is like your number one thing.
Yeah, we talk to clients about that all the time of just like, hey, the word we use for all those things are ad backs, right? Like you have all
Yeah.
these ad backs. A bank's not going to look at this and think, oh, this is a wildly successful business because you're trying to get your taxes as low as possible. You're trying to save taxes now. But I tell them, like, look, there may be 2 years where you're going to pay more in taxes, but if that means that you can get a much higher multiple, it's going to pay for itself in spades. But we just got to take the hit now and pay a little bit more in taxes, take out these ad backs. Because the new buyer, let's say they're doing a roll up, they don't have an extra Porsche or an extra car to put into the business. So they're going to have to take that out, or all these family expenses or these marketing expenses that aren't really marketing expenses, and all these different things that you're doing to reduce your taxes, which are great in the short term. But if we're looking long-term strategy for your business and your exit, we may need to take a little hit now to make it pay off later in the end. So I really like that. Anything
One
else?
other
Oh, go
thing,
ahead. Yeah.
yeah, one other thing on that point too, when you're talking about ad backs, ad backs are generally these owner benefits that you have that you've kind of mixed personal in there, right?
Yeah.
And it's okay to have ad backs, and even legitimate ad backs, it's okay to have them in there. The other problem is I've seen legitimate ad backs, but then you look at the P&L and they've got 20 of them on there. And that is just a big red flag for a buyer because they might be looking at a lot of deals. They don't have the time to actually go through and make sure every one of those is legitimate. It's almost just like a turnoff. And they're like, yeah, I don't know. I don't even want to deal with this one. I'm going to move on to the next deal. And so I've seen really good businesses that have clean ad backs and legitimate ad backs. They just got too many of them. And buyers are like, I don't even want to deal with it.
Yeah.
It just makes it complicated.
Yeah,
So
I agree. You want to look as pretty as possible, right, for the buyer. So I like that. Anything else? So I know I've talked to people about having meat on the bone. You're right, trying to sell at the right time. Is there
sure.
anything timing wise that you can say about trying to sell your business?
Um, so one thing about timing is you can't time the market perfectly. Just like you couldn't with stocks, right?
Yeah.
Obviously, like 2020, 2021, we saw valuations across the board just go skyrocket, right? And now we've seen those pull back 2022, 2023. We're very much transitional years. Sellers had high expectations. Buyers were like, well, interest rates are super high. Like there was this gap here. You can't time it, but you can time just building a great business and then exiting on your own timetable. I generally think like obviously selling is such a personal timeline and there's so many moving pieces with personal goals, career goals, family goals. And you do want to sell at your own timetable. And sometimes I see really good businesses and they think they're going to be in those really good years forever, right? And what happens, you take your foot off the gas, you start going to using your boat a little bit more, you stop, responding and growing, responding to vendors are fast, and you just things start to suffer a little bit because you think those good times are always going to go. You want to sell on the up and up as the business is going up, or even if it's leveled off and it's consistent. The second it starts to take a dip, that's when you just start getting wrecked on the multiples, right? And so if you start feeling yourself burned out, it's starting to, you got to get to a point where you want to exit sooner rather than later. Or you can't let yourself get burned out. You've got to do the right things in your business, hire the right people, bring the right people on board, because you just can't time a perfect market, but you can build a great business and then make sure you're timing your exit at the same time.
Yeah. Have you done a lot of work with putting the right operators in place for businesses that are more lifestyle businesses, and the person, like you said, they're on the boat more, they're on the golf course more, and trying to make sure that the right operator is in there so the business does keep growing? Have you dealt with that much?
Yeah, a little bit. And so I would say a couple things. Finding you'll have I think it's hard for sellers and entrepreneurs to give up control, right?
Yeah.
The reason they're entrepreneurs is because they want full control. So anytime a buyer is like, well, why don't they just hire someone to do that for them? Well, first of all, they don't want to give up control because that's why they're doing what they're doing. And second, if anybody's ever hired someone to be that CEO, GM role, you're going to get it wrong more often than you get it right. So, and part of that is a massive decision. If you're able to transition that person and incentivize them through before you sell and incentivize them through the sale, and they're going to transfer with that business, it's going to be worth a lot more. Um, a lot of sellers and entrepreneurs don't like to do that because they might be taking a few $100,000 off their discretionary earnings and what they're paying themselves to hire that person and do that,
Yeah.
right? And so generally you want to give yourself enough time. You're talking about 3 to 5 years talking with sellers. You want to give yourself some time to find that right person, maybe make some mistakes, make sure that they're up to speed and running. I don't know. Every industry is different and every business size is going to be different. So I don't know if there's tricks to find who that right person is, but establishing that is actually very difficult for an entrepreneur to do because maybe in the short term, they might be paying themselves $300,000 less, right? And that's not very fun. Nobody wants to pay themselves less to hopefully take a bunch of steps forward. And so I actually see a lot of people sell before they get to that point because they're like, I just don't want to, fund the growth out of my lifestyle.
Yeah. So one thing, I'm trying to eventually do with my businesses down the ride, but kind of get some more advisors in the office that can take a lot of that load so I can buy more companies and do things like that. So do you work with a lot of entrepreneurs that they've got a successful business, they're going to put in an operator so that way they can kind of step aside and maybe do something else and grow their capital another way?
Yeah, absolutely. But I work with a lot of people who do that, and then at a certain point, your business has to be of a certain size to be able to do that. And there are times where I would say almost more common that I see is the business can outgrow the desired lifestyle of the entrepreneur, but on the flip side, even sometimes the entrepreneur can outgrow the size of the business. And
Hmm.
so more common with your audience is probably the business can outgrow the desired lifestyle. And in order to go from, 10 million to 20 million in revenue, it's not just 5 people that are really close in the office. They probably got to get to 15, right? So
Yeah.
you got to take a couple steps back. There are a fair amount of people who want to do that. And honestly, it usually makes more sense to hold on to a business if it's cash flowing and you're doing really well, because you're going to make more in the long term. At the same time, I've seen a lot of business owners where they're going to make 50% of the entirety of their business on their exit, right? So these multiples, 4, 5, 6x, this might be half of what they've made in the entire life of their 20 years of running their business in terms of them paying themselves. And that's a pretty attractive offer too, to be able to take 6 years of earnings off, and you're basically doubling what you made in a cumulative manner over the last 20 years.
Yeah. I've got a buddy of mine and we were just talking about he owns service type company. I don't want to say too much because it was kind of a private
Right.
conversation, but he was saying like we would sell if we could get a certain number. Like we've got this high number that we want to get to, and maybe if it's possible, we'd sell now. But to your point, like it's cash flowing so well. It's like we're not in a rush to try and sell this. We're still relatively young. We're growing the business. It's while it's work, it's not, they're not grinding 80-hour weeks right now. They're kind of in a good flow. They're growing, they're acquiring other businesses to help their growth. And he's like, so if I can get the number, if we as a partnership, we can get the number we want, great. But until then, we're just going to keep cash flowing this because we live a great life. They like what they do. They're not in a rush to get out. So there's kind of that yin and yang of, hey, it would be nice to be able to sell, but at the same time, to your point, like you can get more out of the business if you just keep letting it cash flow for a few more years and then eventually sell for even a higher multiple if you, especially if you keep growing.
And I would probably give advice to any buyers out there. Those are very difficult sellers to work with because they're not really motivated to sell. It's a lot to go through the sales process for a seller, even for a wonderful business. You got a lot of peaks and valleys. You're going to have a long due diligence process. It's very invasive. It's like you're showing up to the beach naked, but no one else is naked, right? Like it's very invasive having a due diligence process done. And if a seller isn't ready to sell and they're just kind of testing the waters, I'd probably recommend most buyers to, save your time, save your energy. So,
Well, any other tips or tricks or thoughts of people that are trying to sell their business to try to get, the best valuation or make the process easier?
yeah. Well, I think one last thing I didn't necessarily touch on, and there's this emotional factor of you've been running this business for decades and this business may have put your kids through school. It probably helped you buy your first house. It helped you buy your first boat, whatever it is, right? There's this emotional tie to your business that a new owner won't have, right? And so I think it's easy to talk about it, but being aware of how someone else is going to approach your business, and this is for buyers and sellers. Like obviously, sellers being aware of the emotional history and the ties that this business has to that person's identity and their family's identity is really important to bridge that gap and understand how that's going to work. On the flip side, a seller's got to realize, you know, they might be putting $15 million on the line and they don't have the emotional ties that you have too. And I think that's on both sides, there's a lot of emotion. And if you're able to understand, put yourself in the other side's shoes, then it allows you to have really in-depth conversations of what do you want? What do I want? How do we get this cocktail mix and get this great tasting drink and make it work for everybody? So it's a fun world to be in. And anybody who's thinking about selling, right? It's just keep in mind, it's an up and a down process, but at the same time, it can be very, very rewarding for many people and, and a really good setup for many of your employees moving forward.
Yeah, no, I love that. Thanks. Well, thanks for coming on, Ryan. Two things. One, first of all, like what's something good that you're reading or interested in right now? Any good books or people that you're following that you think these business owners should be following or reading?
Yeah, I actually was just texting this book out I got to pull this up here. It's on my Kindle, to a couple friends. It's a book called I Hear You. I think it's from Michael Sorensen, and I didn't know anything about it. It is an incredible book. It's like $5 for the Kindle. I Hear You, Michael Sorensen. It's about connecting with people and when someone is looking for validation and how to give them validation so that people open up more. Unbelievable book, and I'm only halfway through, so I highly recommend
I've
it.
read it
And
or I listened to it, but yeah, it's great.
okay. Yeah,
It's
and I just stumbled upon it. It's a wonderful book. And then if you looked at my if you looked at my shelf back here, you'd see it's all books of deals from hell and all these other types of books that are all dealing with deals. So the other one is a book called The Messy Marketplace. So for sellers out there, The Messy Marketplace by Brent Beshore is one of the best books out there. And he actually has more of he's got a private equity background. But especially the first chapter will be very applicable to anybody who's looking to sell their business, especially if they go the private equity route. Because it'll walk through some of the emotional tolls that you'll have as a seller, and it's The Messy Marketplace. Wonderful book.
Oh, I appreciate that. Right now, I'm listening to, I don't know if you know who Cody Sanchez is. I'm listening to
Oh yeah.
Main Street Millionaire, which is the new book that she just released. And it's been good so far. She's really entertaining. She says what's on her mind, and her book is true to the way she talks. So I'm really enjoying that right now. Well,
I had her on my show a couple years
oh,
ago,
really?
and what she was saying then, I'm like, man, this really resonates. Like, she's gonna write a book one day and it's gonna crush it. And she's done so good.
That's good.
She's so much fun.
Yeah,
Yeah.
she's a blast to follow and kind of be not that I really know her. You've met her and you had her on your show, but she's just a fun personality to follow for sure. So
She'll
Ryan,
say it like it is.
yeah, she
So,
does. She'll
yeah, go
say,
ahead.
yeah, her book's full of, swear words and stuff like that. It's how she speaks, and it's just how it is. It's great. So Ryan, how can our listeners follow you or get in contact with you or learn more about your M&A practice?
Yeah, absolutely. So, feel free to reach out to me. It's letsbuybusiness.com or, anywhere you get your podcast, listen to my show, but also quietlight.com is my brokerage. So it's ryan@quietlight.com.
Well, I appreciate it, Ryan. Appreciate your time and effort and this great content that you put on the show. And we'll be in touch and we'll talk to you soon.
Awesome. Thanks, James. Appreciate it.
Investment advisory services offered through Raymond James Financial Services Advisors, Inc., Schramm Financial Group, is not a registered broker-dealer and is independent of Raymond James Financial Services. Any opinions of those are of the speaker and not necessarily those of Raymond James. This material is being provided for informational purposes only and is not a complete description, nor is it a recommendation. There is no guarantee that these statements, opinions, or forecasts provided will prove to be correct. Investing involves risk, and you may incur a profit or a loss regardless of strategy selected. Past performance is no guarantee of future results. Prior to making an investment decision, please consult with your financial advisor about your individual situation. Raymond James is not affiliated with any guests on this podcast.